I assure you today, I am definitely not a mimic. Nope, that is not me. This is the real Rowan, not an imitation Rowan. Welcome all of those on the replay. Glad to see you. When last we left our intrepid band of adventurers, those last two chapters that we did were all about, well, mainly about Dueling Club. How the beginning of Dueling Club was about trying to find the chess master, which turned out of all of the students in Hogwarts, to be Ron Weasley. But second place was Cedric Diggory, so he ended up getting put on the list. Second part was the Dueling Club, in which it was, well, kind of humorous, but kind of not, how, completely Milo would trash his opponents, until he ran out of spells, and then they would just trash him for the whole time. But him versus Harry was quite interesting, when they got put up against each other in Dueling Club. That chapter ended with Quirrell explaining that there was a cave in the Forbidden Forest that he believes contains the vampires. He has asked Milo to deal with the pit of vampires somewhere in the Forbidden Forest, who he's sure they're the reasons that there's still unicorns that are dying in the forest. And Milo, of course, is all over that because of the massive amount of XP that would entail. If you would like to read along, here is a link to the chapter where we are. Hopefully that will help. We are in chapter 24. Milo had heard it said that a wizard, given time to prepare, could defeat any obstacle in existence. To be fair, most of those times had been from Milo's own mouth. Also, the saying assumed the wizard had access to magic item dealers and a way to purchase spells, and, for that matter, 3 to 4 meat shields. That said, walking down the dirt path to the Forbidden Forest at 8 p.m. on Friday evening, Milo felt ready for anything. He had a holy symbol of Bacab around his neck with his amulet of protection from evil, a holy symbol of Pelor wrapped around his left wrist like a bracelet, and a holy symbol of Heronius around his right. Even Morty, sitting on his shoulder, had a compact little symbol of the local variety, just a pair of intersecting lines at a right angle. How boring could you get? Held predominantly in his hand. The symbols were all of silver and polished till they shone like mirrors for the optimum effect. He'd whittled 12 wooden stakes, 6 of which he kept in his belt, and 6 were scattered around his person. That morning he'd poured several pounds of fine garlic powder into the water supply before showering. The other Gryffindors had not been amused, but Milo was pretty sure neither would any vampires who tried to suck his blood. Somewhat more significantly, Milo had finally finished the headband of Intellect +4 that he'd been putting off for months. In actuality, it was a small, discreet silver hair clip that would be all but impossible to notice in his tangled hair. Local wizards, from what Milo could tell, rarely, if ever, wore the headbands that were all the rage back in Myra, a city of light, city of magic. But Milo still thought of it as a headband. In addition to making him marginally better at crossword puzzles, the headband significantly increased the number of spells Milo could prepare every morning. Spells which Milo had finally gotten around to researching, and he was dying to test out, ideally on some unsuspecting bloodsuckers. And this time, if only for the novelty of it, Milo had decided to actually make sure that local vampires were anything like the vampires back home. Quirrell had given him permission to read books from the restricted section on the subject, and fortunately, they seemed more or less the same as what he was familiar with. Pale skin? Check. Inexplicably heavy accents? Check. Vulnerability to sunlight, running water, garlic, and mirrors? Check. Fangs? You betcha. What had surprised Milo, however, was their apparent acceptance in wizard society. From what he could tell, they were persecuted, sure, but were still allowed to walk down the street in broad daylight, so to speak. Fred and George said that Honeydukes even sold blood-flavored lollipops, although he wasn't sure how far he could believe anything that those two told him. Throughout the Azael Empire, being publicly known as a vampire was a death sentence. Werewolves seemed to be similarly treated, which, once again, it made Milo wonder why exactly everyone claimed there were werewolves living in the Forbidden Forest, when they seemed nothing illegal with them simply renting a flat in Cardiff. Well, Milo thought, best not to draw too much attention to it. It was a well-known fact that the universe generally responded poorly to any attempt to draw attention to its numerous flaws. Ain't that the truth? Truly feels like, ever since 2020, the universe has been paying us back for every time we've pointed out an inconsistency in the rules. Damn quantum physics. As to these particular vampires, Milo assumed they were either criminals or ex-followers of Voldemort on the run. Either way, Milo thought grimly, they picked the wrong forest to haunt. You're late, Quirrell said calmly as he approached the defense professor, standing on the snowy path, silhouetted by light from the castle. A wizard is never late, Milo intoned, as if quoting an ancient saying. Most timepieces would disagree with you, Quirrell said. Irregardless, Milo winced, we must press on. Oh, Milo said suddenly, before I forget, you'd best take this. Milo fished out a small necklace from his belt and held it out for Quirrell. What is it? Quirrell asked curiously. It's an amulet of protection from evil, Milo explained. In case they try to dominate. Quirrell dropped the amulet as if it was a stone of weight. I think, Quirrell stammered, that it would interfere with my protective charms. You take it. Milo blinked. Quirrell was lying. He'd actually made a sense motive check for once. Sure, Milo said, keeping his voice neutral. Morty can wear it. Why would he refuse protection? Milo wondered. He could only think of 3 reasons. Either Quirrell wanted to be possessed by something, he was already imperious and his controller ordered him to drop it, or he had a different magical amulet on already. Wearing 2 at once prevented either from working reliably. Milo dismissed the first as patently ridiculous, and as for the third, there was no reason, as far as Milo could tell, for Quirrell to lie about that. So, Quirrell was already being controlled by the enigmatic whoever. Unless I failed my sense motive check so badly, I registered a false positive, Milo thought. No, wait, that's impossible, isn't it? Because a sense motive check wouldn't even be called unless he was bluffing, I think. Milo had never paid all that much attention to the NPC interaction rules. That's what bards were for, after all. Well, it was biting him now. Next time I'm home, I'm buying a rule book, and I'm going to auto-hypnosis the entire thing, no matter how long it takes. Regardless, Milo didn't see that he had much choice. If Quirrell was possessed, he'd very likely just kill Milo if he tried to flee. If Quirrell wasn't possessed, then there'd be no reason to flee anyways. Okay, let's go, Milo said, his voice steady with confidence he no longer felt. If Quirrell gave a barely perceptible nod and headed off into the forest. What's the plan? Milo asked, falling into step behind the professor. We go in, we send them back to their foul master, we go home. Fair enough. Does the killing curse work on vampires? It works on anything, Quirrell smiled. Except for dementors. Milo bit his lip to keep from blurting out that he had a pretty good idea of something else the killing curse wouldn't work against. I should probably keep that little gem close to my chest until I find out why Coral is lying to me. However, it did imply that the local vampires were somewhat different from what Milo could not help but consider normal ones. This plane is so weird, Milo said under his breath. I wonder if I didn't accidentally fall into the far realm somehow. Milo harbored brief thoughts of having, maybe, gone beyond the far realm, but cut that line off quickly. Madness lay in that direction. Any idea of their numbers? No. Well, you, sir, are just full of useful information today, aren't you? These experience points. Coral's mouth twisted with obvious distaste. Of which you speak. Will you earn them if I defeat the creatures of darkness? Coral said it as if he were simply making conversation. Yep, Milo said cheerfully. Just so long as I help in some way. The Forbidden Forest, unusual among forests of the world, had a very clear and obvious boundary. On one side of an invisible line lay grassy areas where students were allowed and Hagrid lived. On the other, dense, dark, deep, dangerous woodland. Whether this was due to concerted effort on Hagrid's part, some powerful anti-growth charm, or just one of nature's quirks, the result was a veritable wall of trees. Quirrell simply walked calmly down the path into the cavernous woods, but Milo paused at the border. Just because every trip you've made into this place has ended in disaster doesn't mean that this one will, he said quietly to himself. Besides, it's just trees. Wizards and forests, historically, do not get along well. Wizards generally prefer to live either in massive metropolises surrounded by other wizards, or, alternatively, in precariously crooked towers on the edge of sheer cliffs or floating in the center of a volcano. Forests, on the other hand, were strictly the domain of druids, and the odd cleric of Obadhai, the god of nature, but Milo generally thought of those as wannabe druids. Druids and wizards got along like orange juice and toothpaste. I am a master of the arcane powers, that I make the cosmic forces of the universe my plaything 19 times per day, he said to himself. And there ain't no fur-wearing tree-hugger that's going to stop me from going where I please. If he said it firmly enough, he reasoned with himself, he might actually believe it. Without further delay, he hustled into the woods after Quirrell. Lumos, Quirrell cast, and the tip of his wand began to glow like a torch. Milo winced as his eyes readjusted to the light and realized that, if he were ever separated from the defense professor or Quirrell dismissed the spell, Milo would be all but blind in the darkness. Milo could, if he wanted to, cast dancing lights to create light of his own, but they only lasted for a minute, and he could only do it once. Instead, he fished out his liquid sunlight from his belt of hidden pouches. The small glass sphere held a glowing golden liquid that was originally intended as a grenade-like weapon to mildly irritate light-sensitive creatures, or do negligible damage to vampires for that matter. However, it provided universally more popular pressed into the service as a torch that could never go out, and all for much less gold than an ever-burning torch. Passing the glowing sphere up to his familiar to carry, Milo eyed the sides of the path with caution. The last time he'd been down this way, he'd been with Hagrid to collect the rope and canvas he'd used the time before the last time he'd been here. And that time, Milo's shiver had nothing to do with the icy wind. When we get to the vampire nest, Milo said, we should try to get them all in a group. I'll immobilize the lot, then you pick them off one by one. By far the most effective use of arcane magic in combat was at disabling large number of enemies simultaneously, generally for the big stupid fighters to move in and finish the job. Milo had one Kelgor's firebolt prepared just in case, but Quirrell would infinitely more effective at single target killing than Milo would ever be. Assuming he's not possessed by Lucius or Voldemort or someone. Well, if it came to that, Milo was prepared. He would bet his life, in fact, that's exactly what he was betting, that he'd find a way around the killing curse, to a certain extent, for a few seconds, with luck. As long as he won initiative, that is. Not for the first or the last time he wished he were a cleric and could just cast Death Ward. Be silent, Quirrell hissed. Milo hadn't realized that he was still repeating, I am a master of the arcane powers that make the cosmic forces of the universe my plaything. I am a master of the arcane powers that make the cosmic forces of the universe my plaything, over and over under his breath. Around him, dark bushes and creepers, almost black in the darkness, seemed to be reaching towards him hungrily. Sorry, Milo muttered. Foliage, Quirrell whispered. 3 o'clock. The instant of warning was all Milo needed to avoid being taken by surprise as the monstrous spider, Acromantula, he reminded himself, leapt from nearby undergrowth at him. Kelgo's firebolt! The spider erupted into flame in midair and came crashing to the earth with a heavy thud, where it lay still. I don't understand, Milo said. Everything I've read about these bugs says they're smart. Almost as smart as humans, actually. Supposedly they can even talk. Correct, Quirrell said. So why do they keep rushing us like this? Milo wondered. They can shoot webs. They can think for themselves. Hell, they're even supposed to... Milo's voice trailed off somewhat as he realized he was about to say, they hunt in packs. Glitter dust! Shining golden particles. No matter how many times he cast the spell, Milo was always struck by just how pretty they were. Not that he'd ever admit to thinking that. It'd be undignified for a wizard. Exploded around them. Milo generally used the spell to blind his enemies, but in this case its other function, to reveal targets, served just as well. What Milo had taken to be a cluster of particularly evil-looking shrubbery revealed its sinister nature as a writhing, dark sea of chitin. Ah, hells, Milo said. Run? We'll run, Quirrell agreed. The forest exploded all around them as they bolted down the path, the spiders' hard carapaces making angry, chittering sounds as they rubbed against each other. Why do the spiders hate me so much? Milo asked as he practically flew down the path. I mean, what did I do to them, except kill their nephew? He risked a glance over his shoulder and was surprised to see barely a speck of golden light. At first he thought that maybe he'd managed to lose his pursuers. Then the more pragmatic, less wildly optimistic part of his brain added, helpfully, that no, he hadn't lost them. The glitter-dusted acromantulas were simply being blocked by the swarming masses of their non-glowing brethren. Not only am I going to be eaten, Milo thought grimly, but I've already garnished myself up for it. He was practically sweating garlic. While Milo knew, academically, that acromantulas were not the monstrous spiders of home, they seemed closely related. Monstrous spiders, no matter how large, moved at the same speed as an unencumbered human. The acromantulas, if they were gaining on him at all, were doing it slowly. What they did have that he didn't was endurance. Why the hells did I dump Constitution for Charisma? That has to be the stupidest thing done by a wizard since the dawn of time. Bacab, god of magic, has a higher charisma than Constitution, part of his brain added in defense. Milo's breaths were becoming increasingly labored, and his legs burned with effort. Quirrell, running slightly ahead of him, very slightly, seemed to be doing just fine. You are not Bacab, the other part of his brain added vehemently. Everybody's a critic. I don't suppose, Milo said between belabored breaths, that you can do some magic on them? Against one? Maybe. But on 50? Screw this, Milo muttered. Time for plan B. Web! Layers of sticky strands, stronger than steel, shot out of his hands and created a near-solid wall of sticky webs between the trees on either side of the trail. Web is one of those beautiful spells in which, Even if the victims make their saving throws, they're still pretty much screwed. How's that for delicious irony, eh? Think twice before you try to eat a wizard next time, Milo shouted at the trapped spiders, who were angrily clawing at the webs. Now kill one or two, Milo added to Quirrell. Even as he spoke, he saw that no less than 3 spiders had nearly managed to free themselves from his webs. Doubtless, several others further back were trying to find a way around. Abracadabra! Abracadabra! Quirrell cast the unforgivable curses, that is, unforgivable when he used them on a human, as dispassionately as one would swat a fly. With a pair of eye-searing green flashes, 2 trapped spiders abruptly stopped struggling. But I don't see... Quirrell suddenly realized. The spiders, those that still lived, struggling had taken on a very different form. When you're being chased by an owlbear in the woods, Milo quoted, you don't need to run faster than the owlbear. Just faster than that delicious, juicy halfling. Still, we'd best move along. Despite the grisly carnage behind him, Milo grinned. Just like that, he'd covered 1/3 of the distance to level 6. As he cautiously walked down the snowy path with Quirrell and ran the numbers on experience points, his smile started to slip. Together we killed 3 spiders, Milo said quietly, and I got 450 XP each. I got 600 from the one back in September, but I was lower level then. He frowned, which is exactly how much I would have gotten if it were CR6 and I had help from... Abruptly, Milo stopped moving. If he had help from a CR12 ally each time. Well, what was that? Quirrell asked. Well, we really ought to press on. The acromantulas will get through eventually. It was you, Milo said quietly. Excuse me? It was you the whole time. I've been an idiot. You killed the acromantula. Just calm down and... Without warning, Quirrell shouted, Oblivia! Nerve skitter! Grease! Quirrell's wand slid from his hands and buried itself in the snow. You didn't think I'd say something like that without a ready-to-action to back it up, would you? Mage hand. Quirrell's wand flew into Milo's grasp. Thank you, Harry, for making me learn that trick. This is all just a big misunder... You lost any chance of convincing me of that when you tried to erase my memory just now. So who do you really work for? Lucius? Fudge? Quirrell's mouth twitched slightly. I work for the Dumbledore and the Minister. Yeah, and I'm Pun the Kobold. Morty, get the manacles. Milo kept a set of very heavy steel manacles with one of the best locks on the market to avoid the infamous prisoner's dilemma. That is, what do good adventurers do with a captured orc? Morty dragged the manacles on the ground to Quirrell's feet, then scurried back to Milo's shoulder. Cuff yourself, and don't try anything funny if you want to avoid becoming a greasy stain on the ground. Milo was lying through his teeth. The magic he had available with the most killing potential was Acid Splash. This is madness, Quirrell said, but complied. You don't understand. What I understand is that you've clearly been lying to me for some time. And you took my memories. I want to know why. And Professor, make me believe it. Anybody seen Milo anywhere? Ron asked. His version of Wizard's Chess is surprisingly addictive. Nope, sorry, Hermione said, laying back on one of the common room's overstuffed armchairs. He had that mysterious assignment with Quirrell, remember? Harry said. Oh, right, Hermione remembered. The one he refused to talk about. He's going to the Forbidden Forest with Quirrell, Hannah said calmly. They're going to hunt vampires. There aren't any vampires in the Forbidden Forest, Ron snorted. The werewolves wouldn't put up with them. They hate each other so much it's proverbial. How did you know that, Hannah? Hermione asked, ignoring Ron. He's a terrible liar, Hannah explained. And whenever I ask him about it, he glanced towards the forest. Also, he stayed up late sharpening stakes in the common room and said, "I'm going to the Forbidden Forest with Quirrell to hunt vampires," but I don't think he realized I was there. He often doesn't. "Oh," Hermione said, "so that's why none of the tables have got any legs." "He's doing what?" Harry asked. "We have to go after him." "Into the forest, mate. You're mad. There's giant spiders in the forest." Ron looked like he'd rather kiss Snape than do what Harry suggested. "Don't you remember what happened the last time he went into the Forbidden Forest with Quirrell?" Harry pressed. "Was it that they found buried galleons? Can it please be that they found buried galleons?" "He almost died, Ron." "Oh, come on. Milo almost dies 4 times before getting out of bed every morning. He'll be fine." Hermione frowned and set aside her homework. "I think Harry might be right," she said. "But so is Ron. Look at it like this, though. He's almost died, what, 3 times? 4? Or thereabouts," Harry said. "And why hasn't he? Died, I mean." "Hermione!" Hannah sounded scandalized. "No, I don't mean I want him to. I'm just asking how he always survives." "Because," Harry mused, "well, he gets rescued. A lot." "Grab your cloak," Hermione said, her tone allowing no possibility of dissent. She then glanced out the window. As much as Milo drove her crazy sometimes, they were friends. "And a scarf. It looks chilly." "Fool," Quirrell said. "You have no idea of the forces of which you are meddling." "I tend to hear that a lot," Milo shrugged. On his shoulder, his familiar mimicked the expression. "How about you just tell me, though? If you don't, I'm going to have to assume you're an enemy." "Is that supposed to be a threat?" Quirrell sneered contemptuously. "Fine. Don't tell me. Presumably you're after the stone? Eternal life does sound like a pretty sweet deal. Although, if I leave you here for the vampires to find you, you might just wind up with eternal unlife. Assuming there even are any vampires, that is, and you didn't lie about that, too." "Oh, the vampires are real, boy," Quirrell said. "And alone? By yourself? They'll never let you leave the forest alive." "Detect thoughts. Whatever you do, don't think about your boss." To Milo's surprise, he picked up not 1, but 2 sapient minds in front of him. What the hells? Without warning, the forest exploded into varicolored light. "Expelliarmus!" Quirrell's wand flew from Milo's grasp. "Perfectus totalis!" Milo's hands suddenly flew to his sides and stayed there. All of his muscles stopped responding to movement, except oddly his eyes. He could look around unimpeded. Half a dozen Death Eaters, masks and all, stepped out from the trees in a loose circle around Milo and Quirrell. "It appears my son does not disappoint, for once," said an oily voice from behind one of the masks. "When he said you'd be leaving the castle with only a single teacher of dubious competence to protect you, I thought it was too good to be true. Fortune, it would seem, favors the patient." Milo struggled to speak, but his jaw remained clamped firmly shut. Quirrell was looking at the Death Eaters with a dangerous glint in his eyes. "Release me, Lucius," Quirrell said, "and you will be rewarded beyond your—" "Rewarded by you?" Lucius sneered. "What would I, the wealthiest wizard in magical England, have to gain by freeing you? Who even are you? I see no reason why I should not simply kill you on the spot." You will face my wrath if you do this thing, Malfoy. For I am the Lord." Quirrell broke off, screaming in anguish. Lucius looked around at his Death Eaters. "Did one of you?" He left the question hanging. They all shook their heads, seemingly equally perplexed as the cause of the defense professor's sudden pain. "Forgive me," Quirrell stammered. "Perhaps it is better to say that I have the ear of one that even you, Lucius, would not long regret displeasing. Would not long regret, Malfoy frowned. Because you'd be dead, boss, one of the masked wizards added helpfully. Yes, you'd be departed, boss, said another. Yes, I got that, Crabbe and Goyle. Now be silent. Had the spell preventing him from moving aloud, Milo would have grinned. Like father, like son. I believe you're bluffing, Malfoy said finally. Nobody with friends that powerful would settle at being a school teacher. No, Lucius, you fool, you don't under... Stupefy, Malfoy cast, and Quirrell sagged against the tree. Lucius Malfoy bent over the unconscious teacher and softly whispered, Obliviate. Blimey, Ron said shakily. What happened to all these spiders? Through the folds of the invisibility cloak, Milo had been wrong. It had worked for multiple people at once. They could clearly see piles of dead acromantula surrounding a thick web. It looks like they turned on each other. Hermione sounded sick, although several of them look, well, just fine. Except that they're stone cold dead, Harry added. I think we should keep going, Hannah said. It's safe to assume that Milo had some hand in this. He can't go 30 minutes without needing someone to pull him out of that fire. Despite her words, she fingered a crude-looking flower at her lapel with a fond expression. Right, said Harry, feeling slightly embarrassed. On we go. Said Ron. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but there's a big, dirty web in front of us. Milo once told me that magical webs burn quickly, Hannah said. Brilliant, Ron said. But where are we going to get any fire? Hermione gave him an incredulous look. Where are we going to... Are you a wizard or aren't you? Oh, right, Ron said, looking sheepish. Incendio. You, boy, have given me no end of trouble, Lucius sneered, his eyes narrowing through the holes in his mask. That ritual was hardly supposed to summon an 11-year-old abomination like you, but you'll have to suffice. Milo suddenly saw the reason for the still and silent spell metamagic feats. Without the ability to sneak or move his hands, he was completely helpless. Crabbe, Goyle, carry him. We must move beyond the wards. They're taking me beyond the wards? Milo wondered. No, they mean to disapparate. If they did that, Milo could very well wind up imprisoned in a cavern somewhere in the Earth's crust for all he knew. It could take him centuries to earn enough XP to be able to teleport out of there without monsters to fight. Assuming they don't just kill me, of course. Rough hands grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and half carried, half dragged him through the dark forest. Well, he thought, I am royally screwed. At least I know Quirrell's up to something, for all the good that does me. Quiet, Hermione suddenly hissed. What? Ron asked. Don't you hear that? Someone's talking up ahead. I think I can see light, Harry said, squinting through his sight-augmented glasses. As quietly as they could, the four of them crept along the narrow, winding path towards the tiny points of light up ahead. Looks like 4 or 5 wands lit up, Harry said as they approached. Bet Quirrell and Milo only have 2 between them, Ron said. And Milo's doesn't count, Hermione added. He could have been using his dancing light spell, Hannah said, peering through the trees. It sort of looks like that. She sounded somewhat skeptical, though. Could be, Harry said dubiously. I think we should assume it isn't them, Hermione said, and that they aren't friendly. Good plan, Harry said. He tried to sound confident, but really, what could they possibly do against a group of fully trained wizards? He'd only learned how to disarm less than a week ago. Moving was awkward with 4 bodies under the cloak, but they slowly gained ground on the party ahead of them. Ron's voice caught as they came close enough to see their masks. Death Eaters, he hissed. Followers of you-know-who. Oh, Merlin, Hermione said softly. We should go back and tell Dumbledore. We should have told Dumbledore right at the start. Yeah, well, he's a bit hard to reach, Ron said, living in a password-protected secret office and all. Quiet, both of you, Harry snapped. Those 2, the ones built like gorillas, you see? They've got Milo. He's not moving. Is he... Oh, Merlin, can you tell if he's... Is he still breathing? Hannah asked. No, Harry said without thinking. I mean, I can't tell, not the other thing. They're carrying him deeper into the forest, Hermione mused. They must mean to get outside of the wards and disapparate. Then we have to hurry, Harry urged. And do what? Hermione asked. No, seriously, what do we do if we catch them? They'll kill the lot of us. We have to try, Hannah said. He saved my life once. He saved Neville's too. He wouldn't even think twice. If we take them by surprise, Harry mused, we can disarm the 4 not holding Milo simultaneously. As soon as the 2 big ones drop him and go for their wands, we do the same to them. Then what do we do? Hermione asked. Whatever we want, really, Harry said. We have wands and they don't. Hermione chewed on her lip. Fine, she said finally. But if we don't get them all of them, on the first volley, we run. They won't be casting to disarm, or even stun. Deal, Harry said reluctantly. Filled with equal parts reassurance in having a plan, and abject terror in the face of near-certain death, he led his 3 classmates towards a larger group of hardened killers. Okay, he said finally, ducking behind a tree about 20 paces from the Death Eaters. We're in range. Everyone get ready and remember, practice. It's no different from the dueling club. In the club, Neville won't slay me if I mess up the spell, Ron muttered. We go on 3, okay? 1, 2, There was a short series of loud popping noises, like small firecrackers, and the Death Eaters vanished. We're too late, Hannah said in a dead tone. We're too late. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the end of Chapter 24. Chapter 25, Roll for Initiative. Milo stared up at the dark, dank masonry ceiling, following the patterns of the stone above him, shaking his head in disgust, something he regretted instantly as his vision swam blurrily. At some point, he couldn't remember when, which, all things considered, was concerning, he'd been searched for anything even vaguely magical looking. His belt of hidden pouches, his amulet of protection from evil, his anti-vampire paraphernalia, and, amusingly enough, his wand, were all missing. All that left him with were his magical robes, his headband of intellect, and arcanist gloves, and whatever spells he still had memorized, which was to say most of his best stuff, except for his spell book, which, if he didn't get it back soon, would leave him only capable of preparing the 0-level spell Read Magic, and Milo frowned. He felt oddly like there was a pair of other spells he should know already, but somehow didn't. Like something was missing. He dismissed the notion that he'd been memory charmed. The now familiar feeling that he had could only mean one thing. He'd leveled up. That must have happened when I disarmed Quirrell, Milo mused. Even including the steep XP reduction for non-lethal combat, the defense professor had given him more than enough to level up. Parchment, Milo said suddenly. I need parchment now. When a wizard increases in level, they learn 2 new spells for free. This is supposed to be an instantaneous thing. In fact, it's generally assumed that the spells learned were from ongoing research the wizard was doing before leveling. This doesn't change the fact that if a wizard goes through an incredibly violent day and, say, increases in level 3 times, an unusual but not impossible feat, he can somehow perform months of spell research, not in the space of that one day, but in the weeks leading up to it. Right at that moment, Milo's brain was packed full of roughly 336 hours of retroactive potential spell research. The fact that this was blatantly impossible didn't mean that it wasn't happening. His hands twitched. His head felt like it might explode if he didn't get these spells on paper soon. Looking around the dimly lit room, a single flickering lamp provided what could generously be called light. He noticed that his considerate hosts had failed to furnish his cell with a stationary kit. Milo rolled up the left sleeve of his magically augmented uniform, cursing like a level 10 half-orc dread pirate. I can't believe I'm reduced to this, he muttered. After heavy censorship, that is. Little-used rules allow a wizard's forearm and upper arm to be used as 3 pages of a spell book each, more than enough for his purposes. The long-term thinker in him was screaming in protest at the wastefulness, both in terms of time and money, of his plans. But cold pragmatism ruled here. He still had all of his 3rd-level spell slots filled, but he'd used the lion's share of his 1st and 2nd-level spells in the battle with the Acromantulas. Was it Acromantulae? It didn't really matter now, I suppose. Milo could never tell. He had his paper analog, but he still needed ink. With one last choice curse. It was orc, and it wouldn't translate, so don't ask. He bit deeply into the skin of his right index finger. How long had he been unconscious? 8 hours? More? Wincing with pain, he frantically scrawled the mystic words of power that were the keys to benign transportation and shatter on his arm. The blood ran and spread, but it would do for now. It would have to. As for his feet, craft magic weapons and armor was all but useless to him for now, but he'd need it soon. He could always retrain it later. Some time later, how long Milo wasn't sure in the dark, he heard footsteps, ringing out loudly on the cold stone floor. He quickly doused the nearby lamp and turned to face the door, readying himself. The doorknob turned slowly, and eventually the tall wooden door opened. A masked, robed figure whom Milo recognized by his stature as either Crabbe or Goyle Sr. entered, his wand out and its tip glowing. Shatter. A thunderously loud ring erupted from the thin wooden stick, as if a heavenly optimized hulking hurler had thrown a boulder at a gong the size of a small barn. The light went out as the wand fragmented into splinters, leaving the two of them in near total darkness. In most circumstances, a young boy trapped in a dark room with a grown man built along the same lines as a USS Iowa could hardly be thought to have the advantage. This was not most circumstances. Silent image. The words were barely more than the ghost of a whisper, but in the hands of a wizard, whispered words could be more dangerous than a rampaging worm. What Crabbe or Goyle Sr. saw made the illusion Milo had used on Peeves or Ollivander look like a toddler's crayon drawing. After a moment, the man screamed. "Take it away!" he whimpered through the mask. "Please, just take it away!" "It's out of my hands," Milo lied. "I brought them, but they'll only leave when they're appeased. You wouldn't want to know what they eat." Goyle, or Crabbe, made an incoherent wordless sound. Although, Milo would have bet his spellbook that, had he possessed dark vision, and had the Death Eater not been wearing a mask, he would have seen a manic glimmer of hope in the man's eyes. I suppose there's another way. I might be able to intercede on your behalf, if I had reason to. Yes, anything. An interesting quirk of the way illusions work is that the only way to determine their true nature without magic, or by having it pointed out, is to succeed on a will saving throw. The viewer is only allowed to save against illusions after either physical interaction or by studying them carefully. Milo doubted Crabbe or Goyle was blessed with a high will save bonus, but even a first level commoner can roll a 20. So long as Milo kept the image from actually touching the Death Eater and kept him distracted, then Bigby himself couldn't tell the difference. In short, illusions are like movie monsters. With a little care, even the staunchest audience will believe in them completely until they appear on screen in clear lighting. Tell me where I am, where my gear was taken, and why I was brought here. You're in Malfoy's Manor. Milo was reminded briefly of the treacherous defense professor's stammer. Your wand is in a storeroom down the hall, and you're here for the ritual. Something about the way he said it implied a capital letter. One last thing. Give me the key. Key? Of course, he thought. Wizards here don't use keys. They just use Alamahora to open locks and something else to close them again. Great. Now what do I do with him? Seeing as how he was without his standard issue 50 feet hemp rope, a cardinal sin amongst adventurers, and he couldn't just lock his captive in the room, he was in somewhat of a dilemma. What the hell. He could sit here moralizing over what to do with captured enemies, or he could act and hope for the best. Don't even think about moving, or I'll let them have you. Without bothering to wait for a response, he walked over the Death Eater and tore off strip of the man's robes to bind his arms and legs. Milo didn't have any skill ranks in use rope, because seriously, who trains use rope? But he hoped his crude knots would work. As an afterthought, he shoved the horrid mask into the man's mouth as a gag. Milo turned to leave, but paused in the doorframe. I put a contingent curse on those knots, he said simply. If they ever come undone, you'll die. A silent image could last as long as Milo concentrated, so he changed the illusion from the writhing mass of indescribably awful, unspeakable horrors into a tiny, dull gray ball that orbited his wrist slowly. Normally, he wouldn't bother going through such measures to save spells, but without his spellbook, they were going to be something of a premium. Closing the heavy door behind him, Milo stepped out into a dimly lit hallway. He was somewhat surprised to find it free of guards, but it made a sort of sense. This mad society was entirely populated by wizards, and wizards, by and large, had better things to do than guard prisoners. Not that a couple of low-level muggles with pointy sticks could stop him if they really wanted out, if it came to that. To his right was a narrow, slightly crooked staircase. To his left, a thick door like the one behind him. Didn't take a genius loci to figure out which way that led to the storeroom. The door was, unsurprisingly, locked. Shatter could destroy any non-magical object of up to 60 pounds. The thickly reinforced door weighed well more than that, but when it came to it, what exactly was an object? A door? A plank? Certainly. Part of a door? No, that was part of an object, but one of the several planks making up the door? If they weren't an object, then neither was the door, by the same logic. The door couldn't be destroyed because it was part of the house, and the house was part of the planet. Shatter. Regrettably, he had to dismiss his silent image. The thick chunk of mahogany connected to the polished brass hinges holding up the door exploded away from Milo's outstretched palm. The rest of the door teetered precariously for a moment before falling to the ground with a deafening clatter that could likely be heard from on top of Mount Cecilia. Well, stealth has never been my strong suit any case. Zook, assuming he was still alive, would be ashamed of him. Are any of them alive? Am I the last one? Stepping over the ruins of the once fine door, Milo entered a surprisingly comfortable feeling 10 by 10 storeroom. All it needs now is an orc guarding a chest, he thought wryly. Dusty boxes were scattered about the floor space haphazardly. Locate object, belt of hidden pouches. Heaving a sigh of relief, he allowed the gentle tug of his divination to lead him to a box of seemingly indistinguishable from the others, the lid of which came off easily. Neatly stored inside were his various magical doodads. Milo was about to reach for them, but hesitated. This is far too easy, he thought. Overconfidence was pretty well standard issue among arch-villains, but this was ridiculous. They left him, a wizard with a capital W, alone in a room. He hadn't even been bound, blindfolded, and gagged. Not that any of those would guarantee still spell and silent spell existed for a reason after all. And putting his magic items in a room right next to his cell was simply insane. Frankly, he could have been executed, looted, and left in a ditch by the road somewhere. Milo made too many mistakes by rushing blindly in and ignoring the signs around him. He needed to stop and examine this from every angle before he got himself killed. It was time for an intelligence check. Time to take 20, in fact. What did Milo know? Fact. The Death Eater had said he was needed for a ritual. Presumably they needed him alive, or they wouldn't have gone through all the effort of capturing him when it would have been much, much easier to kill him before he knew they were attacking him. He reckoned it wasn't unreasonable to assume that this ritual had something to do with the one that had summoned him here in the first place, if only because it was the only other time the word ritual and Malfoy Manor had coincided in this particular story arc. So, what was the goal? To send him back? Somehow Milo doubted that a group of villains who could, apparently, eat death would take pains to see him home safely. Fact. Lucius had taken grossly inadequate measures to keep him imprisoned once captured. This either implied a serious lack of knowledge about Milo's magical capabilities, something he doubted Lucius had, seeing as how Snape, presumably acting on Lucius's orders, had nearly had Milo thrown out of Hogwarts by exploiting the differences in their respective magical abilities, or that he wanted Milo to escape. But that was stupidity. Why capture Milo only to give him what amounted to a key, a bagged lunch, and a map out of his cell? Was Lucius looking for some sort of climactic showdown? Surely not. Milo knew little of Voldemort's lieutenant, but among the list of things he did know, self-destructive flair for dramatics was conspicuously absent. Fact. All of Lucius's actions, known against Milo to date, had been with the end goal of capturing him alive. To do that, Milo would need to be taken outside of the grounds, where the faculty and wards would be unable to protect him. None of this answers the question of how I escaped so easily, Milo muttered. Maybe he could have had help from inside Lucius's camp? It was far too tenuous to be listed among his facts, many of which Milo was sure were tenuous enough to make any respectable logician shudder. Yet it seemed the only reasonable conclusion. The only other reason Milo could think of there would be some sort of trap, but he couldn't see any reason for the Lucius and the Death Eaters. A part of Milo's brain idly noted that Lucius and the Death Eaters sounded more like a name for a group of traveling, chaotic, evil bards. To lay a trap for him while he was unconscious and in their hands. If the good guys really had a mole, he had to be someone with enough decision-making power to oversee the placement of Milo's stuff, but not enough to simply leave it with him in prison. So, one of Lucius's right-hand men was a traitor. Regardless, this room was unlikely to explode if he touched his belt, so he suited up. Fact, when Milo had been impervious, his controller had made no effort to order him outside of Hogwarts grounds. Therefore, Lucius, and by extension Snape and Draco, had not been responsible for having him imperious after Christmas. Fact, he had, however, been ordered to investigate the mirror. Fact, Quirrell was a traitor, yet not in league with Lucius. Thinking back to the plot, Milo realized he'd made a serious error. He'd assumed that the evil would be monolithic, one giant, shadowy organization out to get him. This was evidently not the case. Fact, the Philosopher's Stone was obviously hidden in the forbidden third-floor corridor of Hogwarts. Fact, the day the troll was released, both Quirrell and Snape had immediately gone to that corridor. Fact, Quirrell had killed what was at least one of the Guardians of the Stone. Fact, the Philosopher's Stone was the only way for Voldemort to return. Fact, Quirrell had uncharacteristically volunteered to lead the investigation to find whoever was killing unicorns in the Forbidden Forest. Fact, unicorn blood was another way for Voldemort to return. Milo's pulse quickened. Fact, Milo had been a blind idiot to believe the troll was responsible for killing the unicorns, but that wasn't the end of it. Fact, Milo himself was another way for Voldemort to return. Fact, Quirrell knew this, and also knew that Milo required more experience points to do the same. Fact, Quirrell had taken an unusual interest in Milo and had asked several questions about how he leveled up. What was it the professor had said? You, Milo, are a prize greater than any philosopher's stone. Milo felt chilled to his spine, and it had nothing to do with temperature. Conclusion: Quirrell was trying to bring Lord Voldemort back from the dead. No, wait, that's wrong. He already has unicorn blood. Conclusion revised: Quirrell has already brought Lord Voldemort back from the dead. Milo's knees turned to jelly. And it wasn't because of the jelly legs hex. His breathing accelerated into a staccato beat of shallow gasps. The edges of his vision began to darken. I told him everything he asked. I may as well have gone up to the Dark Lord Voldemort and handed him a copy of the rules on a platter. And he called himself a wizard, one of the wise. He wasn't worth his pointy hat. What had he accomplished? He'd as good as told Voldemort, goddamned Voldemort, about the secret workings of arcane magic and the D20 system. Milo had almost killed one of his best friends with a dagger. Reality was his plaything, and he's resorted to throwing a block of sharpened metal. With effort, he steadied his breathing enough to speak. He felt a sharp, metallic tang of metal in his mouth, and he called himself an adventurer, a healer, a hero, an optimizer. I dumped Constitution. What kind of an optimizer am I? Pazuzu. The walls of the room seemed to distort slightly, but it could have been a trick of the flickering light. The slight tremors could well have been muscle spasms. Pazuzu. The lights, what few there were in this basement, went out. He thought he could hear quiet laughter. Pah! He yelped at a sudden sharp pain in his hand. The light returned, as if nothing had happened. What the hells are you doing? Are you trying to get us... Oh, excuse me. What the hells are you doing? Are you trying to get us killed? The voice was small, but it seemed to fill the whole room. A small, slightly overweight, white and brown rat was hanging onto Milo's right hand. His fingernails dug into the fine fabric of Milo's Arcanist gloves. Morty? Milo said in astonishment. I thought you'd still be in the Forbidden Forest. One of the first things a familiar learns is how to disappear when not needed. Morty took on a dry, lecturing tone. And when save or dies start flying at the first sign of a familiar isn't needed. I ducked into my belt as soon as you got paralyzed. I think you mean my belt, Milo said indignantly. And where do you get off biting me? Mordecai snorted, a slightly incongruous sound for a rat. Look at it this way. What happens to you if I die? I lose a bunch of experience points, Milo shuddered. And what happens to me if you die? Milo frowned. I have no idea, he confessed. I could look it up when we get home. Don't bother, the rat interrupted. There's no mention of it anywhere. Centuries ago, when the ancestors of modern researchers first began testing the laws of the universe to determine their rules, they didn't bother investigating it. That hasn't changed since. Nobody knows what happens to a familiar whose wizard dies. Let's keep it that way, shall we? I don't fancy waking up an ordinary rat again. Your fool stunt could have killed us both. Trying to summon Demon Prince? What were you thinking? Look, my intelligence is less than half of yours, though you wouldn't know by looking, and even I know that's a terrible idea. It was the only way. You're true neutral. He'd have no obligation to enter negotiations with you. Once summoned, he could have gutted you like a fish and gone on to God know what else in this plane. Milo paused. You're right. I'm sorry. Did you just admit a mistake? Mistake? I've made nothing but mistakes. Quirrell is working for He Who Must Not Be Named. Now that he knows I'm on to him, he's probably killing my friends. This isn't like you. What's wrong with you? Like you don't already know, Milo said suddenly. You can read my mind, remember? It's an empathically, not a telepathic link, moron. Despite his words, Milo felt a flash of concern through the bond. Whatever. Morty's expression, such as he had, being a rat, hardened. Oh, look at you, summoning demon princes and moping around and making rules errors. You know what you remind me of? The familiar's words were positively dripping with contempt, an effect undermined slightly by the emotions drifting through their bond. Worry, concern, love. Don't say it. But it was hopeless. Milo knew exactly what Mordecai was going to say, possibly because, in a manner of speaking, they were two sides of the same person. You're acting like an apprentice-level hack NPC, that's what. Are you a set piece, or are you a player character? Says the glorified class feature. Hey, at least this class feature knows why he's here. And why, pray tell, is that? I'm here because you're here. I'd follow you into Orcus's throne room. And, more the fool I am, I'd trust you to get us out of there again. But I've only got the intelligence of an average NPC half-orc. Now what are we going to do? You know you suck at giving pep talks. I work with what I'm given. We share skill ranks, and it's hardly my fault you find it better uses for them than perform order. Now what are we going to do? Milo paused, his mind racing. We're going to find Quirrell and stop him. But to do that, we're going to get out of this manor. Again. And why are we going to do that? Mordecai pressed. Because images flashed into Milo's head. Images of Voldemort all cloaked in black with glowing red eyes, torturing Harry and Ron and Hermione and Hannah. Because of Voldemort walking unopposed into the Potter's house 11 years ago and murdering Harry's parents. Of him committing acts so foul that not only did nobody mention them to this day, but that caused fully trained, battle-hardened wizards to fear to even speak his name. Quirrell wanted to unleash him again on this absurd, pathetic, broken, confused, third-party, inconsistent, beautiful plane. Because he'll hurt my friends. Because it's the right thing to do. It should have felt more profound, more impressive, changing one's alignment. Milo felt vaguely cheated. Go forth and kick ass, my master. So he was true neutral, and now his alignment has changed. Please, feel free to tell me what you think his alignment has changed to. It was the smell, of all things, that first clued Manikar that something was awry. It started faint, and he simply ignored it. In a few seconds, it became overpowering, a dank, musty, earthy scent which reminded him of a crypt. Frowning beneath his mask, the executioner drew his wand and stuck his head into the hallway to see what was going on. Snape, relaying Malfoy's orders, had told him to keep an eye on the corridor while the others prepared for the ritual. The oily potions master had been very specific. Mankar was to stand just out of sight of Crabbe. He said it was to optimize sight lines, whatever that meant. A rat scurried between his feet. This was unusual. Dobby would likely be punished severely for his negligence, but otherwise there seemed nothing unusual. Goyle? Mankar called out softly. Crabbe had been sent to stun the prisoner again, in case he came close to waking. But Crabbe should have been just around the corner. Idiot must have wandered off. He was about to return to his post when he noticed, just in sight at the end of the hall, what looked like a pair of feet sticking around the corner. With a sudden lurch, they were gone. What the heh? Benign transposition! Manikar heard a tiny crack, like a mouse disapparating, and suddenly the crypt smell was strong enough to make him want to gag. Mancor whirled, found himself face to face with a walking, waking nightmare. Empty sockets and a huge, misshapen skull stared at him, its jaw grinning grotesquely. The thing, whatever it was, had to hunch over to fit into the cavernous hallways of Malfoy's manor, and its disproportionately long, skeletal arms ended in sharp, serrated claws. Bleached bone thudded against the polished mahogany wood as it walked calmly towards him. Mancor didn't care what it was, and he didn't wait to find out. Abracadabra! A green bolt of hate-fueled death flew at the monster and exploded harmlessly on its ribcage. Mancor stared in absolute amazement. Abracadabra! Abracadabra! Again and again he fired the most powerful spell he knew, the spell that killed without fail, but the abomination simply ignored him and maintained its sedate pace. With sudden lightning speed belying its utter lack of visible musculature, the nightmare leapt. Briefly there was pain, and then darkness. Shatter. The aged, expensive, polished, exquisitely crafted wooden door fell inwards, revealing a familiar dining room. Lucius Malfoy stared at Milo in utter astonishment for a split second, but quickly schooled his face to calmness. So, the elder Malfoy said, I see you've bested Crabbe and Goyle, no more than I'd expected. I suppose you wonder why we've brought you here? Some, Milo said neutrally. There were 12 other Death Eaters in the room, all anonymous beneath their masks. One of them, at least, was probably a mole. The rest could be anyone. Despite his promise to never jump through a window again, he figured his best way out of here was the same as last one. This time, however, he could summon skeletal trolls. Being mindless and undead, they were immune to all 3 of the unforgivable curses, and for some reason, Summon Undead 3 was conjuration, as opposed to necromancy, one of Milo's forbidden schools, so he could cast it without problem. Well, I think you will find that, if you will but listen for a moment, our aims are much the same, Lucius explained. Despite himself, Milo was intrigued. Go on, he said skeptically. If worst came to worst, he could always fight his way out. You were brought here quite by accident, Lucius said, and I swear this by the most noble and ancient house of Malfoy, we are preparing a ritual that will send you back. Milo gaped with genuine astonishment. This was completely out of left field. You do realize that I'm not naturally predisposed to trust anyone wearing a skull mask, right? What, these? Lucius pulled off his mask, revealing his long, platinum blonde hair and politely smiling face. And this ritual of yours, Milo said, it won't by any chance return me home dead or horribly dismembered? Not to my knowledge, no. So what say you? I have to ask. Why? The ritual we mistakenly used to bring you here cost us something, he said reluctantly. Something which can only be regained if you are returned. It is no concern of yours, however. I'm sure you have your own problems to deal with where you come from. Well, there was a matter of resurrecting his almost certainly dead teammates. It was tempting. It was really, really tempting. He could go home. Back to a world that ran on sensible, predictable rules. A world where he didn't have to reinvent the wheel every time he wanted to learn a new spell. A world where not every single citizen had access to at-will, no-save death spells. He could see his home, Myra, City of Light, City of Magic, more than lived up to its name. He could show Thermiar the unimaginably horrid who was boss. He could fight orcs again. God, I miss fighting orcs. And yet... Sorry, Milo said finally. I still have work to do. I'm sorry to hear that. Things would go easier for both of us if you were alive for the ritual. But alas. Milo could practically feel the initiative die rolling in his head as he unleashed his readied action. And that's it. That's the end of the chapter. There's some kind of spoilery Q&A page here about what would have happened if Milo ended up in Robert Jordan's The Wheel of Time instead of the Harry Potter universe. Just in case you're interested in wanting to ever read that for yourself, that is going to be, there you go, in the chat. You can totally do that if that's ever something you want to do. If you like the kind of content we're bringing to you, if you enjoy these bedtime stories, please follow. If you're watching this on YouTube, like, subscribe, share. All of those things are incredibly helpful for us. If you would like to help us out financially, we would really appreciate it, because apparently being in an affiliate in Twitch does not actually pay, at least not to me yet. But regardless, if you would like to help us out in any way, you can always become one of our patrons, or you can purchase us a jittery beverage from Ko-fi. The links for that are in the About or Description section. And I think that's everything. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. I hope you enjoyed the story. I'm sorry we're leaving on such a cliffhanger, but I'm looking forward to finishing the story. It should be done by the end of August, beginning of September. Yeah, I'm looking forward to reading the rest of this story. We don't have much left now. So, thank you all so much. And remember, if people can hate for no reason, then I can love for no reason. I love you, and I wish that you bring love and light to others. Be well, and I'll see you next time.